projector coming on?
Yeah, it's slowly going on. Do the REPC.
All right,
So you're
so
gonna pass one out
am I going to pass one out?
so we can
I was,
fiddle on it ourselves?
I wasn't planning to. You want me to get one for him?
I would love that.
Okay.
Can I get one myself or?
Does anybody else want one?
No.
Okay, let me just go. So sorry, talk amongst yourself. I'll be right back.
That Russ guy.
Russ guy. Sorry.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, that's true. I was wondering, I was like, what did you hear right now?
And he's like, oh.
Oh,
My license expires.
yeah. It's like a lot of people license expires like in March, I'm like.
My name does do March 31st.
Oh.
Hers is
Okay, yeah, that's smart.
kind of a-
You got drawing back over there. It's going. It's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. You touch a lot of agents as far as. Okay, yeah. That'd be frustrating, yeah, but some agents, I just talk about.
Yeah, you're like,
So. They get a little, like, a little snippy.
I don't report it. Okay,
Yeah,
like,
all right,
I can't get worse.
yeah,
It's enough, I can't afford to do it.
have a great day.
You're showing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, what'd you figure out? You can step out and get a
No,
drink.
no, that's okay. Thanks so much.
Okay, I brought two more if anybody else wants it.
I'm gonna take a that one.
All right.
If you have it.
That's why I did it. I was like, just in case somebody else. All right,
Out of my head.
okay, so do you guys want lights on or off?
Fine.
Okay. So, and then just one last thing, time again for you guys on Zoom, make sure you put your first and last name in the chat box. I actually, the last time I taught this, there was somebody that was on Zoom that didn't put their name in the chat box. And I noticed when I sent out the email yesterday of saying to the people who needed to be here for this class, I had put them on the email of, hey, you need to come and attend the class. And I was like, I'm pretty sure they were on Zoom the last time, but what I don't remember, and so why I still send it to them is I think they might have jumped off halfway through or something. So anyway, regardless, just for you guys on Zoom, and I always make sure I say this because it's being recorded so that if anybody ever fights me on it, I like say it 3 or 4 times, make sure you put your first and last name. Because then if they come back later, I was on there, I'm like, well, like if you didn't put your first and last name, sorry. So, okay, so here's what today, so remember I told you guys on Tuesday that we have to, as part of the 12-hour to get you the CE, we have to spend 4 hours out of the 12 hours, which again, as far as the division's concerned, 50 minutes is an hour. So we aren't really going to be 4 hours. It's going to be less than that, but we have to spend 2 of our classes on the REPC. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to go through and just talk about basically the sections in the REPC, which is going to be really exciting. And then on next week on Thursday, I think it's next week, Thursday, Jason is going to come in here and he's going to go through the how do you fill it out kind of a thing. So what next Thursday will look like is Jason's going to come and give you guys a REPC that's filled out wrong. And then have you go through and find all the mistakes, and then we'll talk about how you should fill it out. So the idea being there'll be a little bit of overlap, but so my point in all of that is I'm happy to answer questions if you have them, but this, as far as like what to put on the blank lines was not really my intention of what today is about. Although I'm, like I said, If you have questions, I want to answer them. So if you have a question, ask it. But for the most part, what we're going to do is go through and just talk about the sections of the REPC, just to talk about where a lot of times people struggle with it and or just issues that we see. And again, if you have questions, let's talk about it. Okay. So now here's where I want to start with is, and especially now that I am the principal broker here, I really want to emphasize this piece, just because of even in the short time that I've been the principal broker, some of the things that I have noticed related to this first thing that I want to talk about is this. So right under where it says here, real estate purchase contract, you've got, this is a legally binding real estate purchase contract. So I just want to make sure that that's always where we start with on this is a legally binding contract. And the reason I bring that up is because I am amazed in just the short time I've been the principal broker of the number of times where either agents or clients will come to me saying, hey, we want out of this, whether it's a buyer broker agreement, a listing agreement, or the purchase contract, and thinking that just because they say, I don't want to be part of this anymore, that they should just be able to get out of it. And so I bring that up from the idea of just keep in mind, and it's important, I think, to even help your clients. And I'm not necessarily saying that you need to sit down with them and say, you know, this is a legally binding agreement, although might not be a bad idea. But the more important part to this is Utah law requires you as a licensee that you use this form. So you are required as a licensee to use this form. The buyer and seller, however, can agree to alter or delete its provisions or to use a totally different form if they want to. And most important thing for your clients is if they desire legal or tax advice, talk to an attorney or a tax accountant. Okay. So just keep in mind as we go through this and as you're working with clients on it, this is a legally binding contract. You as an agent are required to use it. The buyer and seller, however, could decide to do something different, meaning with a builder, a lot of times they have their own contracts. And so we can use that because that is the seller then saying this is how we want to go about it. Okay. All right.
A question, Russ?
Yes.
So on that same idea, I have a client that's looking into a townhouse pretty soon. That's my wife.
Okay.
So yeah.
Good.
I mean, so they have their own, the Perry Homes, if they have their own contract, then you can go ahead and just use that one.
Correct.
I won't just say, because to me, I'll be signing,
Yep.
representing myself and my wife, so I wouldn't use this specifically.
Correct. Yeah. If when you go to a builder, they've got their own contracts, then you're going to use those. So it is a little ironic that it says Utah law requires you to use this form, but the buyer and seller, however, may alter it, delete its provisions, or even just use a different form.
Yeah.
So I guess the point of that would be you shouldn't say to your clients, hey, there's this other contract we could use or whatever. But if for some reason your clients came saying, I want to use this other form, then, you know, they could do that.
As long as it's written by an attorney.
Yes, that's, yeah, yes. So the key thing though, to just remember, in the event that were to happen, keep in mind, especially like if it's a builder, they probably had an attorney go out and do it and it's designed for based on what they're doing. If you just had a random client just say, well, I came from this other state and this was the contract we used there and I liked it, so I want to use that contract. I mean, again, if they want to, and the buyer and the seller, so keywords there, buyer and seller want to use a different form, then they could, but there just are some advantages to using a form that is designed for Utah.
So kind of on that point, is that kind of, that clause in there for builders, FSBOs, is that kind of what they're kind of shooting for, or?
Yeah, well, on a FSBO though, typically you're not going to have an agent involved. If you are though, again, you're probably going to want to try to use this form. But yes, that is the idea behind it. So the buyer and seller can decide to do something different if they want to.
Okay.
So, all right, cool. All right, so now let's jump in and so again, my intention for today is we may not hit every single section, but for sure, we're gonna spend time on the ones where I know either we as a company or just where I've seen agents tend to struggle and have some issues along the way. And so we're gonna spend. We'll kind of go through and hit each section. Just know that some of the sections I might just even get to it and be like, do you guys have any questions on this? And that might be the extent of our discussion on some of them. Other sections we'll spend a bit more time on. So, all right, so now let's jump into this earnest money section. So the first question that I want to ask you guys is, how long do we have to get the earnest money deposited?
No later.
So,
After acceptance.
okay, so we have one no later than 4 days after acceptance.
What it says right here.
Calendar,
that one,
14
calendar days.
days after acceptance.
Okay. So I guess, let me ask it this way. Let's say, for example, that I get a property under contract today. So today is the, Thursday, the 19th. So I get a property under contract today. What is the time frame in which to all of that, the earnest money? Like, do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Monday.
It'd be the 23rd at 5 o'clock.
Or
Monday
what?
to have it in hand.
I have it in hand.
Sorry, that was.
No, I was.
I had you turned up a little loud, Christian.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think like, give them the answer.
They said that was the voice of God in case, so I guess whatever Christian said is what it is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so say it again.
I was saying Monday to have it in hand.
Okay, so if we receive it today, so then that would be Friday is 1 day, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. So so good. 4 days to receive it, then what? And you guys can answer, it doesn't have to be.
Well, it has to be deposited to here to your current accounts.
Okay, good. So it has to be then deposited here, but then how much time do we have to get it deposited here?
Broker should have 4-day calendar days to deposit their earnest money.
Okay.
Trust, or the, yeah.
So, okay, good. So I just want to make sure that I'm really clear that you guys are understanding on this, that we have 4 days in which to receive the earnest money. Once we received it, we then have 4 calendar days to get it deposited. Now, the reason why we're spending time on this and really talking more through this is sometimes I will hear agents say, well, you have 8 days to get the earnest money deposited. And is that true?
Well, deposited.
So the answer to that is it depends.
Okay.
Okay, so we have up to 8 days. So keep in mind that it's not just you got 8 days in which to get the earnest money and get it deposited. We have up to 4 days to receive it and up to 4 days to deposit it. So think of it as that way. Is the way I want you to think about this is think of it as 2 up to 4 day scenarios. So we have up to 4 days to receive it and then up to 4 days to deposit it. So if I receive it though, let's say we put the property under contract today, I receive the earnest money tomorrow. Then on this hand, the up to 4 days has been met in 1 day. So how many days do we have to get it deposited then? 4 days. So really we had in that scenario 5 days total. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why I say, keep in mind that it's an up to 4 days. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is as you are doing transactions, keep in mind working with the client, like I would say probably the number one issue that we see in terms of contracts and stuff is typically around the earnest money. And most of the time, it comes down to an agent not getting the earnest money deposited in time. Okay, so which we'll talk about that in just a second. But I have up to 4 days to receive it, and then an additional 4 days, up to 4 calendar days, in which to get it deposited into our trust account. So So now, let me ask this question. So does that mean that going with our scenario, that we have until Monday to receive it, which would mean then we have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays, so we have till next Friday then to get it deposited? Does that mean you could walk into the office here at 5:30 next Friday and hand it to the office and? Now, so why? Why are you shaking your heads no?
All deadlines are done.
What do you mean?
Well, they're. don't they
Well,
close
it's
at
still
5?
Friday.
Well, don't they close at 5 or?
Okay, good. So that's part of it, but there's another piece to it too that we'll come back to. But yeah, so part of what I want you to see from that is keep in mind that just because you walked in here at 4:59 does not mean, okay, we've satisfied, because again, it is 4 days in which to deposit the earnest money into the brokerage's trust account. So yeah, what Greg is saying is right, is just keep in mind, even if you show up here at 4:45, that may not give them enough time to get the earnest money deposited. So as you're doing your contracts, stop and think about it. Keep in mind the holidays and things, because again, this coming Monday was a holiday, which fine, that wouldn't have mattered in this scenario. If you were putting it under contract today, you could still receive it by that fourth day, which would be Monday. But keep in mind as you're doing this of the banking holidays that show up along the way, because had you received the earnest money today, so let's say you'd put it under contract 2 days ago, we got the earnest money today, it has to be deposited by Monday. Well, you're not going to get it Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. So in that case, really, how many days did you have to get it deposited then? You guys are like, I don't know, I'm not even listening to you.
One.
Essentially, you got 1 day in which that would be, you'd have to, if this coming Monday was a holiday, you would need to get it deposited. You'd need to, if you received it, you would need to get it deposited tomorrow, because that's the only banking day that we would have, right?
So I had a situation, it's like you're reading my mind right now. So
Okay.
That's what going on contract. We had till Monday to deposit it. He didn't do it. So on Monday I came in here and I was like, writing up the addendums, they can accept it, extend it to the next day, it's the holiday. That's okay, right?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah, so the key thing is, so just in case you guys on Zoom didn't hear, so the key thing on it is, yeah, if you're not going to be able to meet the deadline, what do you need to do?
They don't.
Yeah, you need to do an addendum to extend that time to do it. Now, so here's the thing though, so, and this isn't totally related to this, but just kind of to keep in mind something along the lines with this. So I got a call over the weekend from an agent saying, hey, we signed the contract after, and actually, I don't remember if it was the buyer or the seller that signed it, but the acceptance of the contract took place after the deadline on the contract. So what do we have to do in that scenario then? Do an addendum to do what?
Extend the day.
To extend that offer in time for acceptance. Well, so they did, and I believe we had the buyer. We had the buyer, they then did an addendum to extend the offer in time for acceptance. The seller got it and said, hey, we've actually changed our mind. We actually don't want to sell the house now.
Oh,
Dang.
So part of why I say that is like, even though, yes, typically we can just do an addendum to fix just about anything. Just keep in mind, though, that depending on what it is and when that's taking place, you do run the risk of a buyer, or in this case, so what you're talking about, Aubrey, you do run the risk of what if that seller, for whatever reason, changed their mind and wanted out of that contract. All they would have to say when you do the addendum saying we're going to extend our time to get the earnest money deposited is no. And then what?
You're out of contract.
Yeah, and unless you can get the earnest money deposited within the 4 days of receiving it, you're within that time frame. If you can't get that earnest money in, your client's now in default. And we'll come back to talk about default.
Yeah, if your contract is expired, but you didn't get the earnest money, or you did get the earnest money deposited.
So no, yeah, what I'm saying, so what Aubrey had said had happened is they were not gonna be able to make the deadline. And was it the deadline to receive the earnest money or to get it deposited?
To receive.
Okay, so he was not gonna be able to meet the deadline to receive the earnest money. So
Right.
then he would need to do an addendum saying buyer shall have until X date to deliver the earnest money.
And you should have got that signed first.
Well, no, sorry, no, in that scenario, he wouldn't have been able to get that signed first because you didn't know you weren't gonna get the earnest money, right? When you wrote the contract, did you know I'm not gonna get the earnest money?
Oh, I thought it was gonna go through,
Yeah.
but he called me the day out, he's like, oh, I don't have, I didn't start anything yet, I was like, oh crap, like, we got today. Came to the office, of course, they were closed, so I wrote on addendum and sent it over to the seller, they signed it, or we signed it, they signed it. And it was fine, the next day we did it.
Yeah, so it's fine. So is that what your question was?
No, I got a little confused
Oh,
there. when you
Yeah,
said
sorry, because
that.
I switched from saying, like, don't miss your deadlines, basically on your offer in time for
So
acceptance.
they deposited the earnest money, but then they didn't get that extension signed in time, and then they backed out.
So yeah, no, let me back up. So that, in that scenario, the one that I got called about this weekend, what had happened is the agents made an offer to the seller. The seller, this part I'm not real sure on. I don't know if the seller didn't sign it in time or if the seller had done a counter to the buyer and they didn't sign it by the deadline. Therefore, the office in that scenario is gonna say you need to do an addendum extending the offer in time for acceptance. The agent did that, but then when the seller got it, they said, oh, well, we've actually changed our mind. We don't want to sell our house. So therefore, your offer is not any good because it was signed after the deadline. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes.
On this earnest money, what are the proper ways that we could receive the money and from a client and handle it? Because are there rules on that too?
Okay, good. Yeah, good question. So in terms of the how to receive it, you're either gonna do basically one of two things. Either they're gonna give you a check, and it could be a cashier's check, could be that they just give you a personal check, whatever it is. Although it is worth noting that if they give you a personal check and we deposit it, and then they were to cancel the contract for whatever reason before 10 days, we're not going to release the earnest money to them until after that 10-day window. Like, we got to make sure that that check is cleared. So if they give a personal check and then 2 days later said, hey, we're canceling the contract, give us our earnest money back, we're not immediately going to give it back to them because we need to make sure that it's closed, which actually, going back in time years and years ago, that was a scam that people were doing, which is why brokerages now say we're going to wait the 10 days. Is you had some people that would go out and write an offer, put down a fairly large earnest money, and then after it had been deposited, 2 days later or maybe even not 2 days, maybe the next day, hey, we're canceling the contract, give us our earnest money back. And then it turns out that there was not money in that account, or it was a stolen check or whatever. So because of that, we have to have proof that it has cleared their account before, or we've got to get to 10 days before we're going to release the earnest money back to them in that scenario. So that's one way. The other way that we would probably recommend that you do it is through Earnest. So there's a website, it's called Earnest with 2 N's that you can go through and your clients can set it up. It's not a wire, it's an ACH transfer that takes place, but that's probably the way that I would recommend. So even, and I don't know if you tried that on yours, Aubrey, but
Yeah, we eventually, he couldn't find the link, it was in his spam folder, that's how I.
okay.
Okay, find it, I was like, check spam, he's like, yeah, I was like, you check it again? Oh, I'll check it again, and it was.
And then it was there, yeah. So that's usually one of the best ways to do it is through Earnest. So there is a small fee to them to do that, but at least then it's taken care of, it's sent to us and we've got it. So does that answer your?
Yeah, so I could, as an agent, I can physically handle cashier check, when I got co-mingled, I can handle one of their checks, bring it into the office.
Yes. Exactly right. So yeah, one of two things. And sometimes the clients will actually show up here to the office to deliver the earnest money, which is fine as well. So either they give it to you or they give it to someone at the company. And then we have a form that we fill out that is a confirmation of earnest money receipt. So one of the things I would say for you, whether you, well, especially if you're on the seller side of a transaction, is it is a good idea to, after that 4 days, well, you know, so again, recognizing it might be 4 days for them to receive it and then 4 days to deposit it. So after that time frame, I think it's a good idea when you're on the listing side to ask for a copy of the confirmation of earnest money receipt. Letting them know we want a copy, seeing that you deposited the earnest money. Okay. All right, let's see. What, any other questions? Oh, I know one. Okay, so how about this one for you? No, go ahead.
Oh,
If you got a question, do yours first.
is there a recommended amounts for earnest money? Is it based on selling price, like a percentage or?
Good question.
10,000, whatever.
So that's gonna vary depending on the market, I would say. Is so a good rule of thumb is to think about like 1%. But it kind of just depends on the market, meaning the last couple of years, people were doing excessive amounts that were a lot higher than probably you typically would do just to try to get their offers accepted. But we're back in a market where you could probably do 1% and you're gonna be good. So. Yeah.
I just remember all the scenarios. I'm probably the most recent person out of the classes. And it seems like every scenario was get rid of that money. That have it again.
Yeah, you don't want to hold on to it.
Do
Yeah.
not hang on to it.
Yeah, you don't want to hold on. Once you get the earnest money, get it turned in as, you know, yeah, just because you have 4 days, don't wait 4 days. Yeah, that's a good way.
It's gonna happen.
Yep. Okay, so how about this one? What if, let's say I was meeting with my client today, and I know we're spending a lot of time on this one, but there's a reason. So let's say that I am meeting with my client today, we write the offer today, and the client is in from out of state, and they just say, all right, I'm gonna just give you the earnest money while we, you know, they're flying back out of town today. So I've shown them properties, we've sat down, we've written the offer on the home they want, they've written an earnest money check, they've given it to me. Let's say now it takes, you know, today's Thursday, so we send over our offer tomorrow, or, you know, late tonight, whatever. They look at it, they counter us, give us till Saturday to respond. My client now gets that counter offer. We look at it, we counter back to them, give them till Monday to respond. Now Monday, they get it, they counter back to us, give us till Tuesday to respond. We then respond and whatever, we accept or whatever. Let's say it's next Wednesday, the offer has been accepted. Okay, so how does that fit into what we just talked about? Because you have 4 days to receive it, which how long have you had it now? If you got it today and it's now Wednesday.
It's 4 days after acceptance.
Okay, good. Good catch. So that's the key thing I want to make sure that you guys see on here is this says after acceptance of the REPC by the buyer and the seller and the receipt of the earnest money. So the key thing is after you have received it. Now, but now let's back up for a minute, because in real estate school, what did you learn for if somebody gives you money, how long do you have to get it deposited? See if you remember real estate school here. Anybody?
Hours?
How many?
24?
No,
Oh, dang it. 5 hours?
25. You're getting closer. Warmer. So 72 hours, 3 days, basically. They give you 3 days in which to get your any monies. So in school, the law says you have 3 days anytime you are given money to get it deposited. So why though now do we have 4 days though? The law says 3. Why do we get 4?
Sure, you turn that money in by 4 days, and you have 3 days to do it. So.
Is Utah law, is it 3 business days?
I don't believe so. I think it's 3 calendar days still. So why do we get 4 when the law says 3?
Is it 3 complete days? So so
Tomorrow.
like if it came in today, it would start counting tomorrow.
Yes, but that's not why we get 4 days, because our 4 days counts the same way. So we have 4 days, but day one would be tomorrow.
Okay.
So the agents wait till the last
I
second.
think what they're trying to do is just give the brokerage a full day to get it accepted. Get it positive.
Okay. Good. So here's the reason. So what it is the law is 3 days, but because the buyer and seller are agreeing on the contract here, so really this contract was written and put together with the help of agents, but by the state. So if for some reason they decided to change it and say, let's give them 5 days, then because buyer and seller are agreeing to it and it's legal, then that change, that it doesn't matter what the law said on that. Because the buyer and seller have agreed it's going to be 4 days, okay? So that's how that plays out on there. So we spent enough time on this money.
You know, I do want to add something that.
Yeah.
came up when we were in the really hot market, is we were getting buyers that thought that the more earnest money was better. So they were actually putting down more earnest money than the actual commission. And then what would happen is, since it was more than the commission, the balance would sit at, it would have been deposited at the other brokerage. So it was kind of like a mess. It wasn't a mess, but it just delayed sometimes us getting paid because some of the money was.
Good. Did you guys on Zoom hear that or no? Did you hear Rita?
So you don't want it ever to be more than your commission.
I couldn't hear very well.
Okay, so yeah, I'll just restate what she said. So during the last couple of years, a lot of times people were, because they were wanting to get their offers accepted, they were doing larger amounts of earnest money. And the way that it works, and this is probably good for you guys to understand if you don't already understand how this works. So let's say we're representing the buyer and we take in a $20,000 earnest money check. And let's say that the commissions that we're going to get paid on it is $15,000. So what happens is, well, actually, let's do it a different way. Let's say that the earnest money is $10,000 that they've given us, and the commission's going to be $15,000. Your commission will be $15,000. What happens is the title company doesn't send us a check for your commission of $15,000. The title company knows we're holding $10,000 in earnest money. So the title company's only going to send us $5,000. Then what happens is the brokerage transfers from the trust account that $10,000 over into our operating account where that other $5,000 was deposited. And then you get paid your commission basically using the earnest money. Does that make sense? So what Rita's talking about is, in the event though that it was a $15,000 commission and they gave us $20,000, then what has to happen then is actually before closing, we have to, as the brokerage, send that extra $5,000 to the title company. Otherwise, they're going to be short in terms of the transaction closing. So the title company in that scenario wouldn't send us any money for your commissions. We would just transfer the remaining $15,000 over to the operating account and pay you. So just kind of so you know, that's how that works. And so what she was saying is potentially that could delay you getting paid. So she's recommending don't take in more earnest money than what your commission is going to be. But the problem is you also don't want to, based on the market we've been in, you don't want your client not to get a property just because you want to make sure you're going to get paid quicker. So don't do that either. So I know that's not what you meant, but I just want to make sure nobody misunderstands, but it is probably a little easier. So
It's not just because it delayed their commission, though, it's that most brokerages aren't set up to transact money going out like that, like the title companies are.
yeah.
That is, a lot of the smaller ones aren't.
Yeah, just a lot of brokerages are not set up that way. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So the other thing too, to just keep in mind on this is, where is the earnest money going to be deposited?
Brokerage.
Yeah. So keep in mind that the contract just says the brokerage. So it really could be either brokerage. Typically, it is gonna be with the buyer's brokerage, so, okay.
Who do they make that check out to then if it comes here?
Yeah, great question. So they're gonna make it out to the Century 21 Everest trust account. But if they just did Century 21 Everest, it's fine, but it's gonna go into our trust account, so. Cool, good. All right, what other questions? Now that we spent 40 minutes on it. All right, it seemed like there was something else that I had a thought though that I was gonna say to you guys about it. All right, if it comes to me, I'll come back to it. All right. The next piece of this down here that we're gonna go to then is just included items. And just keep in mind, as we go through this, as you're going through this with your clients, and especially on the seller side of things, when you're representing the seller, keep in mind all of the items that are in here in this included items section. And make sure that you're having that discussion with your seller as to things being left behind. And just kind of one of the examples of this, we haven't seen it as much recently, but is a lot of people getting like the Nest thermostats. And then what happens was they advertise the property for sale. The buyers go through, they look at the house, they see it, whatever. At closing, the buyer moves in and this Nest thermostat's gone and they've just replaced it with, one like what's on the wall here. And keep in mind anything that is attached to it. So one of the things that I always recommend is when you're working with a seller is just tell them if there's anything that is attached to the property that you're planning on taking with you. And I'll just give you an example of the one that I had that ironically, it was the biggest deal. Like the transaction almost fell apart over this one thing. But I was walking through the house with the seller. And as we were walking through the house, there was a shelf on the wall. And the seller said, "Oh, I'm going to take that shelf with me. So we're going to exclude it." And I was like, okay. And so I put on the MLS shelf in the kitchen, on the wall, whatever is excluded. Well, the buyers came along and said, they made their offer, and on the offer they put include, down here on this other included items 1.2, they put in shelf in the kitchen. And the seller was like, "No, I'm not including that." So we countered and said no on the shelf in the kitchen. And the buyers came back and like became stupid because the buyer was like, "We will not buy your house if you don't leave that shelf." So I know it was stupid. So my recommendation now, though, is when you're walking through a property and the seller says, "We're going to take this, whatever it is," tell them, "Okay, great. Get rid of it now so that a buyer doesn't even see it." I mean, I've had the same thing with ceiling fans, stoves, stuff like that. Like my first transaction ever, the buyer asked for, or the seller had tried to exclude the stove, and the buyers were like, "No, we want the stove." And luckily the seller's husband told his wife, "I'll buy you a new stove," because she was like so attached to it. But just if there's stuff like that they're attached to, get it out, get it replaced with whatever is going to be put in before they even go. That way it doesn't become an issue. So the other piece that I just always want to point out on this is as you're going through and listing a property, if it has solar panels, what do you need to find out?
If they're owned or leased.
That's right, if they're owned or leased. Okay, so just make sure you're asking those questions as you're going through. Next, water service.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
For solar panels, there's an addendum that's specifically for solar panels.
Correct.
Does that have to be included just if there's solar panels at all, or is it only if there's like whatever you call it, a lien on the solar panels?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just say as a general rule, plan on yes, you're going to. If they were fully owned, like there's no loan on it, they paid everything for them, you're probably fine without it. But I would just say do the solar panel addendum every single time if there's solar panels.
I didn't know you could rent them.
Well, yeah, a lot of times people are leasing them or they're making payments on or whatever, but that's what we want to find out. So you need to make sure that everybody knows what's going on. So, all right, next. So this one actually, so section 1.4, I'm probably gonna spend more time on this today because of a phone call I got last night about it. Typically, I probably wouldn't say a whole lot besides, but I am gonna say something. So keep in mind that section 1.4 water service, so the call that I got last night actually is an agent who's no longer with us, and the transaction closed like 6 months ago. But because it was with us and the agent was with us at the time, it's kind of could potentially become our issue, although hopefully not. But keep in mind on this water service section, what it says is the purchase of the property shall include all water shares and water rights that are a legal source of culinary water service to the property, okay? So what happened is, and this was actually on the REPC for land, not ours, so it's a little different, that REPC. But on that particular one, there's a spot that actually says included water shares and then has a blank line. Then it has the wording of 1.4 on the land one is exactly the same, which notice at the bottom, it says the following water rights or water shares, if applicable, are specifically excluded from the sale. So what happened is our agent wrote in on, now keep in mind on the land one, there's a separate line that says included water shares and then a blank line. Our agent wrote in 2 water shares. Then down here on water service, on these blank lines, they wrote in 2 water shares. So did they ask for 2 water shares or did they exclude 2 water shares?
So did they have 4?
Actually, ironically, the seller actually had, I want to say 100 and something shares of water. So if based on this, what the wording of this,
But they only.
if they had written in 2 water shares right here, and let's say the seller had 100, how many water shares is the buyer getting?
92.
Should be getting 98 because they excluded 2 here. So had our agent done just that, they really could have gone, because what the problem is, why this is coming up 6 months later, is the buyer now found out they needed at least 30 water shares for what they were gonna, I don't know if they're subdividing it or what, but they needed more water shares. And so they're now trying to figure out how to do this. Well, had our agent just written in 2 on here, so they put 2 in the included and 2 excluded. If they had only put the 2 here, then they probably could have gone back and said, you owe us 98 shares of water. So here's the key thing though, is, and I have not talked to the agent. This came to me in a roundabout way. I'm assuming the agent's going to call me today on it. The first question I'm going to ask the agent is, what were you intending to do? What was the intention? Because the problem is they wrote 2 included and 2 excluded. So what were you really intending? Now, what's your guess based on what I just told you that they were intending?
I show that they had to, but they wanted to exclude it also.
Well, so my guess is though, and this is why we're spending time on this today, that we might not have if this wasn't for that. My guess is the agent thought by writing it in here, he was asking for 2 water shares. So
You misread it.
I think he misread it because he had put include 2, but then he put exclude 2 here, and I think he thought he was including 2 here. So my guess is the intention was to ask for 2 water shares, even though you could make an argument that the seller owes them another 98 or however many water shares, which that can be a lot of money too. So anyway, key thing for you just to remember, unless something is written on this line, the buyer gets all water shares and water rights that are a legal source for the seller's current culinary water service and irrigation water service. That make sense? Okay. All right, like I said, I'm gonna kind of skip through some of this stuff. Because Jason will go through it next Thursday, talk about a lot of this. But do want to point out section 2.2 here and make sure that you guys are understanding, because sometimes on this one, what happens is that in a buyer may be buying the property and maybe they can qualify to buy the home without selling their other home, or they think they can is maybe a better way of saying it. They think they can do it. So I just want to make sure you guys understand the wording on this section as you go through and do it, because even if the buyer says, well, we could buy it without, there are a couple of key things in here that I just want to make sure you understand. So this is saying the buyer's ability to purchase the property. So this is talking about a few different things. So the first one is their ability to purchase the property. Number two is to obtain the loan referenced in section 2.1C above, and or any portion of the cash referenced in section 2.1E above is or is not conditioned upon the sale of the real estate owned by the buyer. So keep in mind that if their ability to purchase is contingent upon that house selling, then you've got to check is. If it's their ability to get the loan is conditioned upon that house selling, they have to check is. Or, and this is the part that I think a lot of times agents forget and leave out, any of the portion of the cash referenced in 2.1E above is coming from the sale of their house, you need to check is. And sometimes I think agents think, well, they can qualify without it, but they're going to put the money down. They're going to take the money that they referenced up here. So the key thing, I guess what I'm saying is, if for some reason your buyer can qualify, whether they sell the house or not, and they're not going to reference any of the money from the sale of that house up here, you could check is not. But if you write an amount in 2.1E saying, well, yeah, once they sell their house, they're going to put $100,000 of it down. And so you put that here, you should be checking, or you need to check the is box. Is that making sense what I'm saying? So just keep in mind, sometimes agents would check an is not because they're saying, well, they can qualify without it. Okay, that's fine. But did you reference up here that they were going to be putting money down? If the buyer has the cash, whether they sell the house or not, you could do is not. But if they're going to put part of the money in 2.1E on that line, you need to check is. And if that's the case, then you also need to include the subject to the sale of the buyer's residence. So keep in mind, by checking is, you're also needing then the addendum. Okay? Go ahead.
Never mind, I'll ask later. It's not that important.
Okay. Okay, next thing that we're going to hit on is, isn't this fun?
It
This is very
is.
fun.
No, it's not. Okay. I know, if I could somehow get away with only ever teaching like skills stuff, I would love it, but this is better than technology, though, I'll tell you that. That's the worst. Okay, settlement and closing. So you guys tell me, what is the definition? I probably should ask before I scrolled up. What is the definition for settlement? Before you read it.
Signing the title.
Okay, good. Signing is part of it. What else? All right, well, let's look at it
Money
since I got it
received,
pulled up.
Money transferred.
Okay, so here's what it's saying. Settlement shall take place no later than the settlement deadline in 24D or as otherwise mutually agreed upon. Settlement shall occur only when all of the following have been completed. Okay, so there's some things that have to take place. So first is the buyer and seller have signed and delivered to each other or the escrow closing office all documents required by the REPC, by the lender, by the title insurance and closing offices, by written escrow instruction, including any split closing transactions, or by applicable law. So that's the first thing, is they have to sign every document that is required by either the lender, the title company, or the written escrow instructions, or if there's some other law that's out there. And then B, any monies required to be paid by the buyer and seller under these documents, except for the proceeds of the loan, have been delivered by the buyer or the seller to the other party or the escrow closing office in the form of cash, wire transfer, cashier's check, or other acceptable to the escrow closing office. Okay, so just keep in mind, in order for settlement to have occurred, two things have to take place. You have to go and sign any of the documents that are required and deliver any of the monies. Okay, so then what is closing?
Settlement's been completed, the loan has been filled, all the documents have been sent to the county for recording.
Good. Yeah, good. So for closing, that means settlement's been done, the proceeds of the loan have been delivered,
and the applicable closing documents recorded in the county recorder's office. And those things all have to be done within how many days?
72 hours.
4 calendar days. No, 4 calendar days after settlement. So again, we're back to the 4-day kind of a thing. Once settlement has taken place, you've got 4 days in which to have the settlement to have been signed, to taken place, which again, that's what triggers the 4 calendar days. The proceeds of the loan have been sent to the title company and been recorded, okay? And the reason I bring that up is because it's important related to then section 3.3, which is the possession part. So just one of the things that I would recommend for you is with your clients, tell them this over and over and over again, is that just because we go and sign does not mean they're going to get the keys that day. Okay. But keep in mind also that some other states, the keys change hands the same day that you sign. It's just that's not typically the way it happens in Utah. Okay, and keep in mind, especially if you have a client coming from another state, they may show up thinking, hey, we're going to be able to close when, or excuse me, we're going to be able to get the keys when really it may not be, you're just doing settlement only at that. All right, so possession. I don't know, any questions on possession? Anything you want to, should we say about it? I mean, Jason will go through and talk about some of the, which boxes to check and stuff, but the only thing I guess that I will say, and it's somewhat related to what I already just said, is just keep in mind on possession that especially when you're on the buyer side, that you're constantly reminding your clients, because if you don't, what happens is you go to the title company and sign, your client then says to you, hey, we've got the moving truck out in the parking lot. Can we get the keys? And well, it depends on what possession was supposed to be on there, and it could create an issue. So the other question that I have for you guys, because this is one of the ones that comes to me quite often, is possession said, let's just say that it was at recording, upon recording. Okay, so it funds and records. That's taken place. It's that it happens today. Tomorrow morning, your buyer shows up to unload their moving truck, and the seller is still moving out. So typically what happens, mostly from newer agents, but I'll get a phone call saying, what do? We just showed up to unpack and the sellers are still there. So what happens? So that's what they want. That's usually what people want. So for you guys on Zoom, and I guess the rest of the room that didn't hear, Aubrey said, call the police. That's usually what happens. So, okay, so perfect. That's where I was going to go is, so in the event we did call the police, what's going to happen?
What's going on?
The police are going to show up and say, all right, what's going on? And then the agent or the buyer is going to say, well, we bought this house and the sellers were supposed to be out yesterday and they're not out yet. And what are the police? Are the police going to arrest them? No, what's going to happen? So ultimately what's happening in that scenario is the police would try to keep the peace, meaning they're going to probably just go to the seller and say, like, how much more time, what else you got to do to get moved out? Like, here's the thing, is just keep in mind, and it's not a fun scenario, like I get it, but the buyers typically are expecting you to wanting you to like call the police and have them arrested, but it's not going to happen. Like they're not breaking any laws. They're not following their contract for sure, but just keep in mind that the process your client would have to go through is the eviction process. And is that a quick fix? No, it's probably going to take 3 weeks. And is the seller probably going to be out before the 3 weeks?
Yeah.
Hopefully, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
So now if your buyer got there and the seller hadn't even started moving out, then yeah, you might want to say, okay, we're gonna call an attorney and start the eviction process, but just kind of keep in mind as much communication as you can have, both letting your client know, but also finding out from the listing agent, hey, what's the plan? When are your sellers gonna be out? All that kind of stuff. All right,
So you do fill that out. Nobody pulls a contract out and says, looky right here.
you could, yeah, you could pull out the contract and say, you, right here, you guys were supposed to be out yesterday, but is that gonna change? Like, it's, well, no, typically people do, for the most part, they do honor it. But just know you're gonna have times where the mover truck didn't show up, they got a flat tire, the dog ate their homework, like, whatever. Garage door fell on their car, I don't know. So just, there are gonna be times though, that the buyer shows up thinking, hey, I'm ready to move in, and the seller's still like, they're trying to get out, it's just taking longer than they planned, and so, because, the truck broke down or whatever, it's a country song.
They still look at the agent though, right? It's your fault.
You what?
Don't they still look at the agent and say it's still your fault?
Yeah, they might, but again, I would say that's where it's more of how did you as the agent handle it, as far as coaching them and letting them know, and being involved with finding out from the listing agent, what is the plan and when are they planning on being
Set
there?
expectations.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Any questions on the proration section? Understand it?
HOA.
I will say we had a house that was not an HOA that was in by the Capitol
Okay.
that had a special assessment for streetlights going in.
Hmm.
And
Awesome.
ours was a listing and the buyer clicked buyer not thinking about it, and there was a special assessment. They ended up having to pay.
Oh, that's awesome. Good. Yeah. I love hearing that. I mean, I don't love hearing it, but I like hearing it for class to teach it because yeah, that is a very good point, is that, so keep in mind, and most of the time, what you said, Aubrey, is what most people are thinking is this special assessments section could be the HOA, but it also could be a municipality, which is what you were talking about, is they were coming through, putting in these streetlights, and they make an assessment to all of the sellers to do it. So if the buyer, which it sounds like in that case they did, check that the buyer would pay for it, the buyer now gotta pay for the street. And do you remember how much it was?
It was a pretty penny, and it was during when it was kind of crazy and people were trying to get their offers accepted.
Oh, okay,
and
which that makes sense why the
they,
buyer did.
they were like, oh, they're not an HOA buyer.
Yeah, they're like, we'll check that to make it look good, and yeah.
Well, here it is.
But you don't remember how much it was?
It was a couple $1,000s, I want to say, because it was like historically accurate, really
Oh,
pretty
Gotcha.
streetlights
Oh,
by the
gotcha.
Capitol.
Huh.
So
That's cool. Thanks for sharing that. I like hearing those stories to be able to use that with people, because a lot of times agents will feel like, oh, well, it's not part of an HOA, so we'll just split it equally or whatever,
or we see other NA.
Yeah, or other NA, in which case now what's gonna happen? You're gonna have to go back to the drawing board. So, yeah, for me, as a general rule, like it's now in the last 2 years, like you say, it was different. But as a general rule, I always just check seller and just say seller's gonna pay for it. So, but as you brought up, that last few years has been kind of crazy. So, all right, down here under section C is the HOA for the change of ownership. So sometimes they'll call them a reinvestment fee or a community enhancement fee or a transfer fee, which is right here. So there's different names that they can call them. So I live in a PUD, so we have an HOA. And as part of that, they recently, my wife's actually the president of the HOA. And so what the story I'm telling you, we were able to help control it because at the time my wife was the vice president. But our HOA got wind of these reinvestment fees or transfer fees. And the guy that was the president was like, well, you can charge up to 0.5%. So let's charge 0.5% on any transfer fee. Well, my wife came home from their HOA meeting saying they want to do this, and I was like, no, like you got to go lobby to the rest of the people that are on the HOA that we should not do that much. And she said, my wife said to me, well, why? It doesn't really matter. The buyer's the one who pays it. It's not the seller. And so I pulled out the purchase contract and I said, that might be what the management company is telling the HOA president. But when you look at this section of the REPC here, it says who's going to pay for it. And you've got all of these. Now, what I told my wife is I said, every time I fill out one of these, I check the box that the seller is going to pay for that transfer fee. So for me, I said, they might be saying the buyer's going to pay it, because in their mind, they're thinking, well, what does it matter? It's not going to hurt any of our residents in our HOA because the buyer's going to pay for it. And I'm saying, no, what you're going to find is the seller's going to end up paying for it most of the time. So anyway, she went back and lobbied to a few of the other people on the board, and they implemented, because we didn't even have a transfer fee, but they implemented it and charged like $300 or something versus 0.5%. So I don't know. Anyway, my wife yesterday though said to me, the management company is now increasing the fee that they're charging us. So they're charging the HOA like $300 now just to do the transfer, which is stupid, but whatever. It's a whole separate thing. So they may up it some, but
Is that the same deal like Daybreak when they first started?
Yep.
That it cost you so much to buy into Daybreak and now it costs you to get out of Daybreak?
Yep.
And then they started, now they're using money to do concerts. Was it a complaint, the complaining? And so they take the money now and do concerts for Daybreak, but everybody goes.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with it?
probably, yeah, that could be. Because yeah, in essence, these transfer fees, especially if an
And that's
HOA
what
is,
they call it, the transfer
Uh-huh.
fees, because they didn't used it to charge to get out of Daybreak,
yeah,
just to get into Daybreak.
yeah. And yeah, ultimately, these are a way for the HOAs to collect some extra. I mean, hopefully they're using it for smart things to keep the HOA fee down, to keep it low. But
No, they're just spending it.
I was gonna say, in that case, it sounds like they're just spending. So anyway, just keep that in mind as you go through it. All right. I'm gonna skip down here a bit. I'm gonna skip over, trying to keep an eye on the clock as well, so. Any questions on title insurance? Rent agreements? All right, let's do this then. So now we're gonna go seller disclosures. Okay, so on seller's disclosures. The main thing to remember here is, oh, did somebody? I don't know why that popped up.
There are a couple of things.
Let's get pretty close, shelf, yeah.
I was gonna say, I wanna see the shelf now. You ever-
No, it was not that cool of a shelf. Honestly, it was just somebody had, I think like her husband had made it like in their shop or like, it wasn't like, honestly, it was like, what, who cares? I just think the buyer came in and saw, it was like, that's so cute and.
Isn't that a situation where the agent should step in and say, I'll buy you a shelf? I would.
Well, yeah, you could, but for
It's
whatever.
not that shelf though,
Yeah, I was gonna say, you're not gonna get that shelf when you buy one. So that's,
one of a kind.
yeah.
So there's a couple of things on title insurance that I think are really important.
Okay,
One is that buyer and seller both pay title insurance. And the second is that if it's a cash buyer, you're gonna close at the seller's title company because they have to buy the insurance, the cash buyer doesn't.
yeah, so that's a good, yeah, I'm gonna restate that just so that
Yeah,
people in Zoom can.
restate it in a better way.
Oh, I don't know if it'll be better, but, okay, so there's just the main thing on the title insurance is just keep in mind that typically it, outside of Utah, I don't think they do split closings as much. And in fact, when I first got my license, it was like unheard of to do a split closing. But it kind of gained momentum over, not long after I got my license, it started to happen. And it gained this momentum to where the buyer wanted their title company and the seller wanted theirs. And part of that was, I think the marketers from the title companies would just say, hey, I know you're going under contract, and typically the seller would choose the title company. And marketers from title companies started telling the agents on the buy side, well, you know, just tell them you want to close the buyer with us. And it was a way for them to get the policy for the buyers. But if it's a cash transaction, you have to use the same title company unless the buyer wanted to pay for a lender's policy, which I don't know why you would do that if you're paying cash, but typically the seller's going to pay for an owner's policy of title insurance. The buyer's going to pay for a lender's policy. And on a cash transaction, there's not a lender's policy. So the title insurance commission will not let the on the buy side to facilitate the closing if they're not issuing a title insurance policy. All right, seller disclosures. So on the seller disclosures, the main thing I want to point out to you on this is notice here in section 7, it says no later than the seller disclosure deadline referenced in 24A. Seller shall provide the buyer the following documents, and then it lists A through L. Just keep in mind that it is required that you give them everything that is applicable from A to L. A lot of times agents, and I honestly was guilty of this myself for a long time, is A is a written seller property condition disclosure. Most agents, even still today, that's all they ever send over. You get it under contract, on the seller side, they send over the seller property condition disclosures. They feel like they've met their obligation. But keep in mind that in addition to that, you also have to give the lead-based paint disclosure if it's older than what year? 1978. So you also need to give a commitment for title insurance, a copy of the CC&Rs, and any minutes if it's part of an HOA, along with the budget and financial statement, any long-term leases or rental agreements, a copy of short-term rental, a copy of existing property management agreements, evidence of water shares or water rights, written notice of claim, like all of those things that apply are part of that seller disclosure as well. Go ahead.
How much of this is responsibility of me, the agent, versus the title company? Aren't they the ones doing all this?
Great question. Technically, this is your buyer or your seller's responsibility. But you're representing, so you're gonna probably do it.
So what we do is we copy and paste to our sellers, say what we have, say what we're waiting for, and then once we're not aware of, we literally will bring none that we're aware of. And at the bottom, it's like, if we're wrong about any of these, you need to tell us and send us copies. Then we send the same thing to the buyer's agent, what we've attached, what we're not aware of, or what's not applicable. That way, if anybody comes back, it's like, we asked, you never said anything.
That's
We gave
great.
you this, you know, this is what we gave you, you didn't ask us about it. That
That's
way
a
it covers
really good
us.
idea.
Because we don't know people's personal.
Yeah.
Property things, so you know, it covers us on our end and giving it to the
But and
buyers.
especially like you're saying here is written notice of any claims or conditions known to the seller, like as an agent, you're probably not gonna know that. So.
Yeah,
So just one sec, I'll read it. So what you're saying, let me make sure I understand, is you print this off and then send it to the seller.
so I'll send it to the seller first, say what we have, so if they've already, because we get, we try to get SPCDs, title insurance, CCNR, HOA documents, which are the hardest to get, so we'll write like, you've already completed this, we'll provide this to the buyer's agent. This is not applicable, your house was built in 2005. We've already received this from title, we'll send this to the buyer's agent. We've got this from title, we were sent to the buyer's agent. You've sent us the minutes, but we still need the budget and the financial statements for the HOA. That way we can then, none that we're aware of, because we don't know if there's any short term.
So you're telling the seller, that, like on.
So we send it to the
written
seller,
notice,
and
saying
then we
none
also
that
send
we're-
it to the buyer,
Right.
once we have everything.
But
attached. Yeah,
on like written notice, you're
Yeah.
saying
none that we're
none
aware
that we're
of.
aware of. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's a great idea, by the way. I think that's a really good way of doing it, because then for sure you've met it. Now, here's why that's important.
You just put it on there.
Well, yeah, first you're having the seller, because the problem is, what she's saying is right on. The seller may have some written notice, but unless you have specifically asked them for that, they just might not think to tell you. So I think that is a really good idea of sending them this and saying, here's what we're aware of, what we have, here's what we need to know from you is, are you aware of any of this other stuff? So that's good. Thank you. Okay, here's why that's important, is a few years ago, there was some people who were. I don't know if this, I was gonna say smart buyers, but I don't know if this is really smart or not. But what they were doing is they knew that agents typically send over the seller property condition disclosures and that's it. So they would go out and write an offer on a property saying, here's $20,000 in earnest money on this home. They would get it under contract. Then you've got your seller disclosure deadline in which we have to give all of this stuff. And then the agent would send over only the seller property condition disclosures. And then the buyer would come back later on and say, you're in default. You didn't give us a copy of the commitment for title insurance. Therefore, you're in default. And we'll go to section 16 here in just a little bit. And they were saying, not only do we want our earnest money back, we'll take $20,000 from you. It's not a bad business plan, right? I'm just kidding. Don't do that. So you had a question though, Aubrey.
Yeah, really quick. If they lie on that, it's all like. We didn't know about this. They, like, for instance, if that condition, property condition form is filled out, and they say, oh, has there been water damage or whatever? They say no. And there's obviously like plain sight, like water damage, like, can I say, hey, what's going on with that? And like, or.
So yeah, good question. So there's a couple of answers to that. So based on what you just said, if it's in plain sight, like meaning anybody walking in can see it, it's not hidden at all. Technically, you don't need to disclose it because it's clear. Like if you walk in, like the example is if there was a huge hole in the wall right here, and like you walk in the front door and you can see that hole in the wall, you don't need to disclose there's a hole in the wall because they can clearly see it. If there was a picture hanging over that, now you have to disclose that. So when you say it was clear that there's water damage. Now, to some extent, I'm only a little hesitant on this is like, depends on what you mean by clear, but like there's water there dripping, then I'd be like, yeah, you don't need to disclose that because it's dripping. Now, with that being said, still you should. But for sure, you as an agent, if you see something or you know of something, the idea of the seller disclosures is to disclose things that are not just obvious. So, you know, if there's no front door on the house, you don't need to disclose there's no front door, like they can see it, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but with that being said, always err on the side of over disclosing. Like, and let me give you the example I love to use is I used to be with Coldwell Banker years ago, and we had an attorney on staff there at the office, and we had a few different ones, but the one in particular we had, he was selling his house up in Farmington, and the buyers, for whatever reason, told them that they were not going to do an inspection. And he told me personally this. He said, I went through my seller property condition disclosures and I checked yes on anything that was even possible that might be an issue. I checked yes. And I asked him why. And he said, because when you're filling out the seller disclosures, if I checked yes on it, and then the buyers ever had a problem in that area, they could never sue me. Because he said, if you went to court, a judge would look at it and say, they told you, yes, they had a problem with that. Why didn't you check it out? You should have checked it out. So he only did that because they weren't going to do a property inspection. So I am not recommending to you to tell your clients, hey, if they're not going to do a property inspection, go say yes on every single thing. Yeah, but that's what, you know, he just said like about cracks in the stucco. He said, if they were doing an inspection, I probably would have put no, but because they're not, he's like, I checked yes on everything because the chances that they're going to sue me go way up with them not doing an inspection, that they're going to move in and later on be like, oh, we didn't know that, whatever. So I guess what I'm saying in this is help your clients to see it's not a bad thing to disclose. Like just, we naturally feel like, well, I don't want to disclose that we had a leak from, you know, the dish. I'll tell you from my house, we had one day, my wife had started the washer washing some of the clothes. We left and the hose, like it rattled or whatever and came out. And so then when it drained on the floor, which then drained through into the storage room. So it didn't really ruin anything, but we had a water leak. Well, most sellers would look at that and go, okay, well, like we cleaned it up, there wasn't really any damage, therefore I'm not going to disclose it. Versus when I sell my house, 100% I'm going to check the box, yes. And then I will tell them, here's what happened. Because again, as long as you've disclosed that, like the chances of somebody being able to sue you and win on it go down drastically. Because if they don't go check it out, a judge is going to look at it and say, why didn't you check it out? Like they told you. So I've only had one of my personal transactions end up in court, and it was in small claims court. And it was around that same thing. The buyers were saying the sellers, so the buyer moved in, a tree root grew into the sewer, which then backed it up. They then sued saying, number one, the tree root grew into the sewer. And they were suing, basically saying the seller should have to pay for that. But then also said that the seller didn't disclose that they had water in the basement. And that once they moved in, they noticed a water line on the wood because the basement wasn't finished. So the studs that were in there, they noticed there was like a water line. So they were suing the seller. The seller called me, they had moved to Indiana. Said the buyer's suing me for $1,100. And what do I do? And I just said, well, how much is it going to cost you to get a flight? And back then with the short notice that she got, which I don't remember why that was, but she was going to have to fly from Indiana to here. At the short notice, it was going to be $1,100. The buyer was suing her for essentially $1,100 plus or minus. And I was like, well, rather than spend the money, just give it to him. And she was like, no way. I'm not, because we didn't do anything wrong. So I said, okay. I went and said, so let me go look at your seller disclosures, because that's the thing. If your client ends up in a lawsuit, almost every time the seller disclosures are going to be what either helps them get out of the lawsuit or hangs them. So I go get the seller disclosures, look on it, and luckily she had disclosed, yes, they had a flood or something in the basement. So she had disclosed it. So we showed up to small claims court. The buyer says, here's why we're here. The judge, who really is just an attorney pretending to be a judge, says to us, okay, what's your response to this? We handed him the seller disclosures. Right here it says we had disclosed there had been water in the basement. So he turns to them and says, you signed this seller disclosure that says they had to have water. So why are you saying they didn't tell you? Well, we didn't really read it. Well, that's your fault. They said, yeah, but what about the tree roots growing into the sewer? And he said, that happens in my neighborhood every year. Somebody has that. We live in an established neighborhood. Somebody's tree roots grow into the sewer and it backs up. Welcome to home ownership. Not when the case is over. So
Hey, Russ, is there like an outline or something for seller disclosures, or we just send them A through L and say, fill it out?
oh no, there's a separate form.
Okay.
So yeah, Jason will go over that with you next week.
Okay.
There's a separate seller property condition form that they need to fill out. And we just recently updated that and it's now 16 pages. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. All right. Next thing, what are we doing time wise? We gotta pick up the pace. All right, next thing is, so as far as buyers canceling is due diligence. That one's pretty self-explanatory. If you have questions, stop me, but I'm gonna go a little bit faster because I want to spend some time on section 16. But buyer, if you check is, buyer can cancel for really any reason they decide up until that due diligence deadline and they get the earnest money back. On appraisal condition, the main thing I want to point out on this is if the property fails to appraise, what does the buyer have to provide in order to cancel? There's two things. On 8.1, they only need one thing. Here they need two. What do they need for an appraisal?
Copy of the. Or notice of appraisal value.
Good. So right here. So if the buyer receives written notice from the lender that or the appraiser, that the property appraised for less than the purchase price, which they're calling that a notice of appraised value, They can cancel by providing written notice to the seller with a copy of the notice of appraised value. Again, this is another one of those things that most agents don't do. Most agents send over the contract cancellation saying that it failed to appraise. Technically, they are not within their right to cancel. They also have to send over this notice of appraised value. And that can either be a copy of the appraisal or something in writing from the lender stating that it didn't appraise. Okay, so just keep that in mind when you're canceling on appraisal, you need two things, the notice of cancellation and the notice of appraised value. Okay. Section 8.3, they can cancel at any time prior to the financing and appraisal deadline and get their earnest money back. With the exception, though, of this section right here. So whatever amount they put in there is how much the buyer is saying is if they cancel after due diligence, but before the finance and appraisal deadline, and they're canceling based on finance, they could give up X amount of the earnest money. So whatever dollar amount you put in there. Make sense? Any questions on that? All right, let's go to section.
I have a point though.
Okay, go ahead.
Financing and appraisal deadlines are usually on the same day, but they are two separate deadlines. It's really important to know that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna re-say that for Zoom. So it is important to remember that even though on the contract it has one date, finance and appraisal deadline, those are actually two separate deadlines. There's an appraisal deadline and a finance. So I don't know why we chose to do it that way. When I say we, meaning the state, whatever. But if for whatever reason you wanted to, you could do an addendum and change to have the appraisal date to be different than the finance date or vice versa. So anyway.
Or you could drop one, like if you're renegotiating for the end of the contract and you're past that appraisal, but you're still waiting for finance, you can just extend out the finance.
Yeah, you could extend out just finance and not. Yeah, if you extend, if you did an addendum saying financing to be whatever date, that does not automatically change the appraisal deadline. So unless you said finance and appraisal deadline, you would only be changing the one. All right, mediation. Well, we're just skip through that. Just know on shall or may, there are advantages to both. But okay, so default. Let's go through this now. So if the buyer defaults, so if for some reason the buyer ends up missing a deadline, doesn't do what they were supposed to do as part of the contract, then the seller has three different options. Okay, and it's important that you understand how this works. And because if you ever call me of, hey, Russ, I got a question for you, my first answer is probably always going to be, well, what does the contract say? Like, let's look at the contract. And for the most part, just know our contract is going to give you how to deal with pretty much every scenario that we are going to run across. Not always, but for the most part. So if the buyer defaults, here's what the seller has the options to do is A, cancel the REPC and retain the earnest money, deposit or deposits if applicable as liquidated damages. So they can just say, we're going to just keep the earnest money. Or they can keep the earnest money in trust and sue the buyer to force the contract to take place. Okay, so if for some reason the buyer defaults, seller can either take the earnest money, they could say we're going to leave it in the trust account and we're going to try to force you to then still buy the house, which that's going to be a little bit harder than when it's the other way around. But or three or C on this one, return the earnest money to the buyer and pursue any other remedies available at law. Now, let me explain why this is structured this way, because the contract that we used before this one, I think it was the one before this one, might have been two before, but regardless, the way it used to be set up is if the buyer took the earnest money, that was liquidated damages, they could never sue. So,
You mean if the seller took their.
sorry, yeah, the seller, thank you. Sorry, if the seller took the earnest money as liquidated damages, that was there is in essence saying like we're made whole because of the buyer default. Well,
That's A.
that would be section A here. So it used to be there was only two options. Take the earnest money or leave it in trust and sue them. Well, there are scenarios where maybe the seller feels like the buyer defaulting has damaged them more than the earnest money. In which case, they would then return the earnest money to the buyer and then they could sue them to go after that higher amount of money. So really, that's kind of the way that you would want to think about this for your seller. If the buyer defaults, is the earnest money going to satisfy them as far as the liquidated damages? And if the answer is no, like it actually hurt them worse than that, then they probably are going to either want to give it back to them or just leave it in trust. And probably I would say the better is leave it in there. And well, sorry, that's not true. They can only leave the earnest money there if they're going to sue to specifically enforce the contract. So the other option would be give it back to them and now sue them to go after even more. So I guess what I'm saying there is the risk they run of giving it back and suing them for even more, if they lose, they get potentially nothing. Versus they can just cancel it and keep the earnest money. So this is the scenario of this where you really have to stop and kind of think, because Rita brought up of like, be careful on getting a huge amount of earnest money. And keep in mind, there are pluses and minuses to that. And one of them being, if they did a huge earnest money and then the buyer defaults, meaning they missed getting the earnest money deposited or whatever, they miss a deadline, the seller has the option of just taking that earnest money, just saying we're canceling and keeping the earnest money. Now, the flip side of that, though, is if then the seller were to default and the buyer's done a huge amount, it could be a good thing. So kind of just depends on what's going to happen. So let's look at on the seller default. If the seller defaults, then they have the same options, but basically in reverse. Okay, so if the seller defaults, the buyer can elect one of the following. A, cancel the REPC, and in addition to the return of the earnest money deposits, buyer may elect to accept from the seller as liquidated damages a sum equal to the earnest money deposit. So keep in mind, sometimes you'll hear agents say, well, if the buyer defaults, the seller gets twice the earnest money. Or I said that backwards. If the seller defaults, the buyer gets twice the earnest money. That's not really true. The buyer gets back their earnest money and then an amount equal to it. Okay, so that's what they're saying here, is that the buyer could elect to accept from the seller as liquidated damages a sum equal to the amount of the earnest money. So it's not like they get double the earnest money, it's they get
And earnest money.
the buyer gets their earnest money back, plus they would have already agreed that the seller would give them as liquidated damages an amount equal to that.
So someone on the website when you check that if something happens, or did you just come to an agreement?
What do you mean? I'm
Like,
not sure what you're saying.
If the seller defaults, is there something in place already above in the REPC that shows that if you default seller, you'll have to pay us an equal amount?
No, it's just right here.
It's just right there.
That's where it's at. Yep.
Okay.
That's where they're agreeing to it. Now, in the event they were to default, then you would send over a buyer's notice of cancellation saying, and you'll check a box basically saying these buyers electing to take an amount equal to.
They accept that. Or-
Well, they already did accept it.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Oh, wait, so that's in it. So-
Yeah, yep, because it's lit, note, it's said right there, the buyer, and again, which so I tie that back to where we started this whole thing. This is a legally binding contract. And the seller has already agreed to, this is what you would do. Yeah, yep, good. So then the other option is maintain the earnest money and in trust and sue the seller to specifically enforce. That's more likely. Like you're more likely to be able to go to court and force a seller to sell the property than you are to force a buyer to buy. I mean, and especially let's say that the reason the buyer's not buying is because they can't qualify for the loan. Good luck going to court and having a judge say, well, you still have to buy the house when you can't get a loan. Versus the seller, they could still say, sorry, you agreed to it, you got to sell your house. So
But the buyer could back out due to financing deadlines, right?
as long as they do it within their
Yeah.
finance and appraisal deadline.
So what's the example of seller default? How is the seller?
I've had that.
I've had it happen.
Yeah, sure.
We had a seller who was selling his house and moving to Mongolia for work. And after we already went under contract, he found out that the Mongolian government was gonna tax him a lot of money on his sale of his house, and he went, oh, that's not worth it to me. I'd rather rent it out, I don't wanna sell. So we had to go to the buyer, tell them what was going on, thinking it's a good buyer, and they decided to take option A. So they gave him the equal earnest money amount. I want to say we might have given him a little bit more
Okay.
too, but yeah, it was a kind of a very strange.
Yep.
Situation, but they were gonna lose most of their, what they were gonna get in selling their house.
Yeah, and usually it is gonna be for some reason, whatever the buyer or seller's reason for selling was changed. Like I had one that a neighbor of mine, I was helping him sell. He got a job with Microsoft, was gonna move to Seattle. Went to work, was there for like 2 weeks and was like, yeah, I don't like this job, I'm not doing it. And we were already under contract, came back and said, what happens if we cancel? I pulled out the contract and said, you'll have to give them an amount equal to, or they might sue you to try it. And in that scenario, the buyers really wanted the house. I don't know what they would have done, but I said, I would not be surprised if they said, we're gonna go to court to try to sue you to specifically enforce the contract. So anyway, but usually it's something in their life has changed. Somebody dies, job transfer, falls apart, whatever.
The only Christian on Zoom, the only problem with that too is like the buyers potentially
I think we lost you.
would have to come out so much out of pocket just in legal fees.
Yeah, that's just it. They may or may not do it, but it's definitely more likely for a buyer to try to enforce the contract than it is the seller's going to. So, and then the last option is accept a return of the earnest money and pursue other remedies available at law. If the buyer elects to accept liquidated damages, seller agrees to pay the liquidated damages upon demand. So that's where, Aubrey, to answer your question, that very last sentence there is, if the buyer elects to accept liquidated damages, seller agrees to do it upon demand. So I don't think many agents explain that to the seller of, hey, in the event you default, you've already agreed, you're gonna, so to some extent, we should probably with our clients, when we're talking about the earnest money, be saying to our seller, if for some reason you changed your mind, you've already agreed, you'll pay them back X amount. So are you sure you want that $100,000 earnest money? You know, whatever. All right, we good on that? The next one, attorney's fees. So this one actually I want to hit on real quick because we actually have a scenario going on within the company right now where, so section 17 says that in the event of litigation or binding arbitration coming out of the transaction, that the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. So a lot of times agents will hold off on, and I'm speaking generally, not necessarily just our company, but agents in general, hold off on having their clients sign a like buyer broker agreement until they're writing an offer. And I've seen actually some, which we have actually a lawsuit happening right now in the company, where the agent did not, he wrote an offer for the buyer, was actually a limited agency scenario, did a limited agency agreement, but never did the buyer broker. Well, this buyer is now suing us and the agent. And in the event we win, which we should, because it's a stupid lawsuit, but we should win. But because the agent never had the buyer sign a buyer broker, there was no agreement in place that the buyer would pay our attorney's fees if we ended up prevailing in court. So therefore, we probably will win the lawsuit, but we're still gonna have to pay all of our attorney's fees versus. So just, I say that from the standpoint of don't hold off on getting a buyer broker signed because our agent didn't intentionally not get it, but he just hadn't done it. And then the deal fell apart. He was like, doesn't matter anyway, because it was a multiple offer scenario and the seller chose the other different offer, but he's suing us because he's saying his offer was better. Stupid lawsuit.
That is ridiculous.
It's stupid, but at the end of the day, we got to do all of our attorney's fees. And at the end, we aren't going to be able to go to him and say, you got to pay us because you didn't sign the buyer broker. Okay. Next one here. Notices. So I want to make sure on this one is if somebody sends a text message to you saying, hey, my buyer's canceling. Is that serve as notice?
No,
Why?
has to be signed. a signed item by whoever's canceling, the buyer or the seller, and has to be received by us no later than the date on the, so you can't say they're canceling at 4:50 before the due diligence deadline and then send something the next day.
Okay, good. So now, so keep in mind on this, under the notices, it says they have to be in writing, signed by the buyer or seller giving notice, and received by the buyer or the seller or their respective agent or the brokerage firm representing the buyer or seller no later than the deadline. So just an agent sending you a text saying we're canceling, they might think they've served notice to you, but they really have not. Because it has to be in writing, signed by the buyer or seller. Now, I did hear just within the last 2 weeks, I was over at a hearing at the board for, I'm on the professional standards, and so I was on a hearing there. And one of the agents that was on the panel with me there was talking about, apparently there is a lawsuit happening right now where, because the agent's text message has their signature on it. So let's use the example of, let's say that the seller sent to you a text saying, I want to cancel the contract because of due diligence or whatever, and then you forwarded that on to the other agent. Would that count? Is it in writing? Yeah. Is it signed by the buyer or seller giving notice? Probably we would have said no, but right now this lawsuit is going because the buyer had a signature line on their text, so it had their name. And what they're arguing is they did sign it because of that signature on there. So to some extent, what they were saying there is, if you have your name that automatically populates on the text, you might want to consider taking it off, because depending on what happens with this lawsuit, they may say that counts as same as if you actually signed it. So interesting, but we'll see what happens with it. But so just keep in mind, any notices have to be in writing, signed by the party giving notice, and received by the buyer or the seller or their agent or the company. So if you're ever having a hard time delivering a notice, like the agent's not responding, take it to their brokerage. And that counts as well for notice.
So just sending an email with that sufficient?
Yeah, well, the hard part with that is, did they receive it? It has to be received. So if you sent the email.
If you're already communicating with them, you would assume it's received.
Yeah, it's gonna
If they
say
received every other one.
Yeah, if as long as it is one that you're doing to that, then yes. But
I know
they could say I didn't receive it. That I didn't check my email until later, so I didn't receive it.
I know the office tells us when we're doing a buyer cancellation, we have to upload the email where we show that we sent it
Yes.
and the actual cancellation.
Yeah.
And I'll usually go back in once they say like received or thank you, I upload that email just showing that it's received.
Yeah, that's the other thing I would say, that's the other advantage of sending it like through Loop or something, is because even if they say they didn't receive it, Loop will track if they clicked on it and looked at it, it'll show they opened it and looked at it at this date and time. So anyway, so good. All right. Let's see. Oh, we're gonna wrap up here real quick, but let me just point out a couple things real quick. Time is of the essence. Remember earlier I talked about receiving the earnest money. We don't have until midnight to receive the earnest money on that fourth day. It's by 5 p.m. So all of the dates are going to be 5 p.m. unless it states somewhere otherwise. Okay. And acceptance. What has to happen for acceptance to occur?
Everybody has to sign and there has to be communication that everybody has received and signed.
Good. So there's two things that have to happen. Buyer or seller has to sign the offer or the counter offer indicating they've accepted it, and seller or buyer or their agent has communicated to the other party or their agent that the offer's been signed or the counter offer accepted. So those two things have to happen, has to be signed and communicated. So that differs a little bit from the notice. Remember, notices have to be in writing, signed by the party giving notice. This has to be just signed and communicated.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, this has come up multiple times. So response time on the acceptance, right? So
Which, by the way, there is no response time. There's a deadline for acceptance. I know it's a minor difference, but
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so I write an offer, you know, we give the seller 3 days for a response. They decide to counter 5 days later. And then our compliance says you have to get an addendum to extend out the response time. And the other brokerage says, no, you don't, because it was a counter, it wasn't accepted.
That is true. So on a counter, so that, yeah, that is correct. So I'm gonna restate it for Zoom. If, so we've got down here and which, so what I had just mentioned, we as agents, and I'm guilty of it too. We call this a response time, but it's really an offer and time for acceptance. So they don't have to give a response, is really the idea of that, but in the event that we miss the deadline is what Rita was talking about, and then the other side sends over a counter offer 5 days later. So we're 5 days past the deadline on section 25. The other side sends back a counter offer dated 5 days later. Do we need to do an addendum extending section 25 to that? And the answer is no, because a counter offer is a new offer. So in essence, they've resent the offer to you, and by the seller, or I guess the buyer, because it would be coming from the seller, accepting that, then brings everything else back into line. The difference would be if you just sign it, if you sign acceptance after the deadline, you're gonna need an addendum. So think of it that way. If you do a counter offer past your deadline, you're fine. You're not gonna need to do it. If you sign acceptance after the deadline, we're gonna require an addendum extending the deadline. And that's tied to just the story I told you earlier that we just had over the weekend, where the agent did the extension, but now the seller wants out. And I know it's kind of a bummer for that agent, but the truth is the seller could have come a week or 2 weeks later and said, now, the place where we have a little bit of an argument in our favor, I feel like, is the seller, after accepting it, sent over property condition disclosures and has been communicating as if the transaction, like that, even though they signed it after the deadline, they've been acting like it was still there. So we do have an argument of you proceeded as if it was accepted, and who knows what will happen with it. But anyway, all right, thanks for being here. So I sent an email, but just a reminder, because I may not have gotten it to everybody. I can't remember, might have been your email.
Yeah.
Did you? Because somebody's bounced back to me and I don't know if anyway,
I didn't get it.
My emails, I never made the name.
maybe that's why. I don't know. Anyway, here's the key thing. Next week, we have to do the classes at 10 o'clock instead of 11. So next week on Tuesday and Thursday, they'll start at 10 because at noon in here, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is going to be the Tony Robbins thing from noon until 2. So we just have to be done earlier. So hopefully I'll get out a reminder to everybody, but just remember Tuesday and Thursday next week's at 10, then we'll go back to 11 again. Okay.
Is the Tony Robbins thing gonna be live or Zoom?
Yeah, no, it'll be Zoom. It's live over Zoom. Live over Zoom, like, I wish Tony Robbins was gonna be, no, I wish, that'd be cool, but no. Yeah, it's just something he's broadcasting out over a Zoom, so.
Thank you.
But yeah,
Thank you.
but I don't think you can watch it if you're not in this room. I don't think we can share the link.
Secretary, on the third floor, on the corner, 3 offices and function, that whole thing.
Okay,
There's a lot of lists.
Thanks, guys.
I wanna say.
okay, so.